What is up, everyone? Aeneas here. Welcome back. Today we've got the last video before the new set drops. We're going to be looking at some honorable mentions. These are 10 decks that I've brewed, fleshed out pretty well, but maybe not perfect yet. And these are decks that I think have a very good shot of being good in standard, but I didn't feel were as concrete as the top 5, so that's why these were not in that video. But yeah, let's go through them pretty quickly, look at some other ones. We'll also talk a little bit about what's been working well in the early access event and cards that seemed very strong. And I made, disclaimer, I made all of these decks before the early access event, so I just happened to get a lot of the cards correctly. Also the ones that were on my top 10 list. A lot of them did turn out to be very good, so yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit too. But anyway, without further ado, let's look at the honorable mentions. Okay, so number 1, these are not in any order, by the way, just totally random. But I guess the first few are a little bit more thought out and the last few are a little less thought out. But anyway, they all could be good decks. All right, sorry. Number 1, blue-red proliferate spells. So this is a similar kind of deck that we've seen already in the ladder. Similar to the mono red and similar to the kind of prowess decks we had from before, but with a little bit of a twist. So this one is about proliferating, and so in our 1-drop slots we have the Iron Apprentice and we have Vindicative Flamestoker, and we also have the Exuberant Fuseling, and then Electrostatic Infantry, Balmor, and finally Arcane Proxy on the top end. So the idea of the deck is you have these cheap creatures which want to get counters on them and do get counters on them for casting spells. And then we also have in our spells category things like Experimental Augury, which proliferates and gets us some carded selection. And so that will increase the number of counters on the creatures. We also have Volt Charge, which is a burn spell that also proliferates. So 3 to the face. And proliferates all your creatures, so your creatures get bigger. Yeah, all of it's just really solid. And the Arcane Proxy is another creature we can have on the battlefield. Works with a Balmor, cast a spell for us, so we can recast our Experimental Augury or play with fire or whatever we want to, and burn them out with that, and proliferate with this. So just kind of a way to recast some of our spells. It's also Ancestral Anger, recast the Ancestral Anger, stuff like that to pump your guys and draw you cards. So yeah, it's just kind of trying to beat down the opponent quickly and proliferate the counters on your creatures. So that's why we have these 3. And Vindictive Flamestoker, it's one I called out, said was going to be really strong. Early access event, it was really strong. And it gets counters. The more counters, the cheaper you can sack it for. You can sack it on your opponent's turn when they try to kill it. You can sack it after you block with it. So it's just really good way to refill on these kind of cheap aggro decks. So yep, that's deck number 1. I think it has a real good shot in standard, to be honest, with seeming how aggro the new standard looks like it's going to be, and proliferate seeming very strong. So it has a good shot. Okay. Next one, we got Dimir. And also, just letting you know, I have a lot of Dimir decks in this honorable mention. Not biased at all. But yeah, you'll see there's quite a few different ideas for Dimir. All right, so this one is a control style deck, Dimir Control. And it is centered around poison and toxic. But not just that, we also have a lot of planeswalkers to use with the proliferate mechanic. I think in my last Dimir deck, I didn't get to use Vraska because my deck was too low to the ground. And so I wanted to make a deck that uses Vraska pretty well. And I think the best 2 planeswalkers to go with Vraska are Liliana of the Veil and Teferi Temporal Pilgrim. Because Liliana, one of the big problems is you play it on 3, you minus the 2, now it's at 1 loyalty, and you know, you can't really do much with it. So if you can get a proliferate spell off or a Vraska, 0 to proliferate, then you can immediately use it again to do another -2. Also, it's not that hard to get to her -6 but a lot of times you'll get like really close to the -6 and then the opponent will like kill it or hit it or damage it or something. So a little bit of proliferate might be enough to where you can almost consistently -6 with the Lily. That's what I'm hoping. So we'll see how it plays out. But I think those were kind of the two things that held Lily back a little bit. Is he didn't always want to +1 with her. The -2 was great and the -6 is great, but it's sometimes hard to get to that. All right. And then Teferi, you know, it has counters. It makes a creature that gets counters. So makes sense. You want to proliferate, you make both the creature and Teferi bigger. Yeah, just makes sense there. And then, as I mentioned, we're proliferating. So we got Drown and Ichor. We got Experimental Augury, both really good proliferate cards. We're playing the prologue to Phyresis to put the poison counter on the opponent, and we can proliferate that as another version of the win con. Vraska also proliferates that. And we're also playing Voidwing Hybrid because this is just a really solid creature in Dimir, and it's kind of annoying. It's a good blocker. You know, you can play it on 2, block the aggro decks. They kill it, you trade, or probably most of the time you trade because it has 2 power, right? So you trade, and then next turn you proliferate and you get it right back. So just value right there. Hard to deal with for the opponent if they don't have exile or graveyard removal. Yeah, so it makes sense. It's also another evasive way to put toxic and poison counters on the opponent, which you can then proliferate. So try to think about the other poison counter spells, but they were all pretty weak. So I think that's, besides prologue to Phyresis, that's your other way to get poison counters on the opponent. And why do we want poison counters on the opponent? Well, we want to get to at least 3, so we can turn on our Anoint with Affliction, so we can turn on our Bring the Ending. And I mean, that's the main thing. If you win with it, that's a plus, but you don't have to win with it. Okay, and then we've got one Ichor Gauntlet just as a fun of and a cool spell, and it actually did pretty well in the early access event. Not like all-star, not like amazing tier 1, gotta play it in your deck, but pretty good in some Planeswalker heavy decks, and so yeah, I think it makes sense. Proliferate, take an extra turn. Whenever you cast a spell, put a counter on a target. I think that's the key one there. So if you have this down and you get like a Lily down, then you just cast a few spells and you can get your Lily to the 6 loyalty that you need to ult. Anyway, yeah, makes sense. All of that works together. Bank Buster, another target you can proliferate. I know it's a little counterintuitive to proliferate your Bank Buster, but if you just want the cards, yeah, proliferate it. Blast Zone, also another good target for proliferate to help you get rid of those aggro decks with 1 and 2 drops. Yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. So let's move on to number 3. Number 3, Counter Stompy. So I put Gruul on my top 5 list. I think Gruul is a little bit stronger with the oil synergies, but by no means is just green Stompy not gonna be viable in this format. It has so many big creatures. I couldn't even decide on what were the best way to go. Pure big creatures may be better, but I liked the idea of having the counter synergy. And so we've got you know, this small creature that gets more and more counters. Gallagher gets more and more counters. We want our Kyrian Beastcaller to get more and more counters. When it dies, it moves its counters somewhere else. We have the Bloated Contaminator, which has Proliferate. So it's going to proliferate all the counters on all our creatures. So that's really one of the key pieces in the deck. Same thing, Simian Simulacrum puts counters on your creatures. You're going to proliferate it, stuff like that. So it's going to be very hard for your opponent to deal with like how quickly your creatures are growing. They're just growing bigger and bigger, and you're proliferating and getting bigger and bigger. So I think it's going to quickly overwhelm any sort of creature-based deck. And if the control deck doesn't have just a bunch of sweepers in their hand, they're also going to not be able to deal with it. So I think it has a real shot of being very strong. I also really like this card, which not a lot of people tried out, Unnatural Restoration. So usually these cards are a little bit too weak, like 2 mana, get something from your graveyard. It's kind of like a bad cantrip in blue. However, this one has Proliferate attached to it, so I think that makes it very, very strong in these kind of counter synergy style decks, because you know, let's say you play Evolving Adaptive turn 1, then like turn 2, Kyrion Beastcaller, and the opponent's like, well, I don't want your adaptive to keep growing, so let me kill it. So then you kill it, they kill it. Then your turn 3, well, or I guess, I don't know. It's not a perfect scenario, but anyway, you can get it back, you can play it, you can proliferate, and you get the idea. So maybe not turn 3, but turn 4 or something. Once your other creatures on the battlefield have counters, then you get back your 1 or 2 drop, and you proliferate, and you make everything bigger. So it's not just a draw a card type spell. It becomes a draw a card plus an anthem because it makes all of your creatures bigger. So yeah, I think that's pretty good. Maybe it should be a 4 of, not sure. I also put in some of these removal and the Tyvar stand, hexproof, indestructible, +X, which apparently turned out to be very good. I just had it in here because it seems strong to me, but apparently this was one of the really strong cards in the early access event as well. Yeah, okay, that's it for number 3. Let's move on to number 4. Number 4, this is just pure Izzet Prowess, so very similar to the Izzet Proliferate deck, but less synergy on counters and more on just casting spells. Also, the new include is the Flamestoker, which, as I mentioned, is just a very strong card. Very good for these small, low to the ground aggro decks. And we're also running Free from Flash. Wow, that is so hard to say. I don't know why. To give our Flamestoker oil counters so we can draw quicker. And it's also just a pretty cheap 1 mana pump spell for our creatures. So it's good with the Trample, it's good with the Balmor, it's good with the Vindictive Flamestoker, it's good with everything, I guess, really. And then we got the typical burn and draw package and things that we had before. So not a whole lot changed on this one, but I think this Flamestoker might be enough to tip the scale in your favor with the Izzet Prowess type deck and make this viable, because you just have easy ways to refill your whole hand. All right, moving on to number 5, Dimir, Jace, and Jhin. So we had the kind of mono blue deck before with the Haughty Jhin and Tolarian Terror, and I think with the addition of Jace, it could be even better. I've also taken this deck a little bit more in the Dimir approach, but you could go mono blue with this as well. I liked the idea of using things like Gix Command to get back some of your Haughty Djinns and Terrors. Also the fact that Jace could mill like Siphon Insight or Memory Deluge, all of that seemed really nice to me. So I went with that style approach, and even had Founding of the Third Path to recast some of your spells, and mill you to help get your Terror turned on, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different ways to make this deck. This is by no means the final version, but I think there's probably some form of either mono blue or Dimir, it probably needs a few more counter spells in here and things like that. I went more with the recursion idea, and you have alternate win con of milling your opponents if you really want to. Apparently CGB had a lot of luck with Jace milling the opponents, so definitely an option. If you're not winning with the creature war, then you can mill out the opponent. All right, so that is number 5. Let's look at number 6, blue-white Tezzeret artifacts. You gotta try it. Every new set has new artifacts. Tezzeret is still a very strong planeswalker that hasn't seen like tier 1 or tier 2 play. I've had quite a few successes with Tezzeret in the past, in the last 2 standards, and I think he's still good. And we got a nice couple new additions that are gonna be very helpful in making this deck even better. Maybe still not tier 1, but it will probably be a fun tier 2 deck. So before we had like Combat Courier, which you can use as a blocker and a draw outlet, because Tezzeret lets you activate your artifacts abilities for 2 less mana. So Combat Courier is basically a free sack to get a card, and then later you can unearth it and do the same thing, free sack, get a card. Combat Thresher was a nice early game drop which draws you a card, and then later you can also be casting it for 7 mana to get just a nicer win con body, I guess, a 3/3 with double strike and draw a card. New addition here, Mer Convert is a mana dork that's an artifact that also has Toxic. So I like the idea of getting a little bit of ramp in here that's also an artifact for our synergies. I'm also adding in Skrelv's Hive. This one was one that really overperformed in the early access event. And turns out that it creates a bunch of 1/1 artifacts. So that really works with our Tezzeret synergies, and it works with things like Disruption Protocol or Counterspell, Make Disappear, things like that, yeah. And the life gain that you get later on in the game could be very nice. It's also a win con, so eventually if you can stall a game long enough, then you're going to win with this thing. Yeah, so this should be a 4 of maybe, but I feel like 4 is too many. You don't want to take that much life loss. So I went with 2 of this and 2 of the Mer Converse, but we'll see how it works out. And then the last new addition is the Surgical Skull Bomb. Again, Tezzeret makes the activated abilities cheaper. So 1 mana and potentially 1 blue at some point later in the game to bounce the opponent's creature and draw you a card. Just seems really solid. It's possible we want the white spell bomb in there, though that's more creature synergy based, but yeah, maybe. And Bankbuster's solid. Again, you get to draw cards for free with Tezzeret, so very nice. Disruption Protocol works with all of these artifacts to counter stuff for 2 mana, so also very nice. Yeah, that's it. So just you get some of the cheap creatures down, use them as blockers, draw some cards, sweep the board, and you can make 4/4s with Tezzeret late game. You can get your big combat threshers down once there's no creatures on the opponent's board, things like that. So very solid. And we also added a Mirrex in here to give us another payoff for having extra mana and making artifacts with that. All right, so that's it for, what are we on, number 6? So we're moving on to number 7. This is blue-red artifact aggro. We saw a similar aggro list with blue-white earlier, but I think Saheeli is a very strong planeswalker as well that wants artifacts. And this may not be the list, but I think there is some case to say that there could be a blue-red artifact aggro. You got this Enthusiastic Mechonaut, which hasn't really seen play, but is a pretty solid card on rate. 2 mana for 2/2 flying that makes your artifacts cheaper. Malcator's Watcher, I mentioned already before in another video that this is a solid card, similar to the Legacy Elves kind of thing. And we also have Voltage Surge, which is a good removal for artifact synergies. Mishra's Research Deck is a good red artifact draw card, so definitely a lot of good red and blue artifact stuff going on, and so I definitely think there's a good shot that something like this could work. All right, let's move on to number 8. Number 8 is Dimir Arcane Spells. This is kind of a control-y deck that wants to make use of us casting non-creature spells. So we've got Hercule, we've got Arcane Proxy, we've got the new Trawler Drake, which grows for each non-creature spell we cast. And then we have some proliferate spells in here that we can recast with Arcane Proxy. We got some Planeswalkers, we got Vraska to proliferate. Yeah, so just kind of a control deck, but a little bit of a twist on it with some creatures that haven't seen a lot of love in Standard, but have very strong effects. All right, coming at number 9, this is another Dimir deck, Dimir Mill Graveyard. This is dealing with like kind of reanimation type stuff, but also value from milling yourself. So we have things like Gnawing Vermin, which mills you when you play it. It also is pretty good against aggro because it has some -1/-1 effect. Jace, again, we want to mill ourselves and we get some draw from that. And then things like Monstrous Warleech want big creatures in the graveyard to give it power. Undead Butler gets you card backs from the graveyard. Cityscape Leveler is something you can cast out of the graveyard. Drivnod also wants you to exile cards from the graveyard to give it indestructible. So a lot of things want stuff in the graveyard. We even have Cemetery Tampering to cast stuff for free once we hit the 20 cards in graveyard threshold that Jace also wants. So you want to mill cards, get 20 stuff in your graveyard, and then you can hopefully cast things like Cityscape Leveler or Drivnard with your Cemetery Tampering for free. That's the goal. Yeah, so this one seems more solid, and then I have a kind of a memey one as the number 10 one. So Dimir Jace aggro. So this is like, you've got all 1s and 2 drops, but all of these 1s and 2 drops have good graveyard synergy. So you play your 9 Vermin and you mill a few things, and you're probably gonna net like 2 or 3 cards because you get an Ashnod Harvester, which you can cast again. You get a Lantern Bearer, you can cast again. Razor Lash Transmog, which you can cast again. Tenacious Underdog, etc. You get the idea. So you can cast all of these from the graveyard. Same thing for Jace. Jace mills you 3, or however many you want to mill with Jace, and you're gonna net a bunch of value because almost everything that goes in the graveyard you can cast from the graveyard. So yeah, that's the idea for this one, and that is the last of the honorable mentions. Let me know what you think. Any of them look good to you? I think a few of these first few, like the Proliferate one, the Control deck, look very promising to me. Maybe even the Tezzeret one, to be honest. So I'm definitely going to try some of these out in the coming weeks after the set releases. But I wanted to share them with you, let you see some cool ideas, cool brews that I came up with. And please share some of your ideas. Maybe I didn't touch on some decks that you're trying out. I know there's like a Rot Priest one, which people were really high on. So I'll have to brew something around that. But yeah, let me know what you think and what decks you are trying out. And probably this will be the last video before the set drops. So we'll have to see what is working after that. Until next time though, see ya.